My name is Arnold Michaelis. 15 years ago, in October of 1958, I was given the opportunity of filming a conversation with Pandit Nehru at the Prime Minister's residence in New Delhi. As a matter of fact, it was my first film experience. The legend, which had developed during Mr. Nehru's lifetime, accompanied me on the flight from New York. And by the time I landed at Palam Airport, it had practically overwhelmed me. The conversation, or parts of it, which you are about to hear, removed for me the distance between the myths about the Prime Minister and the reality of the spirit of Jawaharlal Nehru.
To retire, I'm not thinking of that present
activity.
Well, no, not from activity, that I accept. And when I talk about retirement, it has nothing to do with retirement from activity, public activity. But I do think that it would be good for me and good for the country for us to have a respect from each other. From office, if I left the office of Prime Minister, that of course, you see behind that, if I may say so objectively, is a great deal of conceit. Because I know, even if I'm not Prime Minister, I'm very important still in India.
This was the question I raised.
Yes.
That the mantle of Nehru,
yes.
the atmosphere of Nehru, must remain what it is in India, regardless of any official change of office. And you're aware of that.
Yes.
When you were supposed to stand for re-election as President of Congress, and apparently you weren't too anxious to stand for re-election at that point. And you wrote an article, I believe it was for the review, the Modern Review in Calcutta. No one knew that you had written it. It was completely anonymous. But to me, it points up your really tremendous gift for humor, as well as your capacity for satire. And this is what it says in part. Hail Jawaharlal. For nearly 2 years now, he has been President of Congress. Steadily and persistently, he goes on increasing his personal prestige and influence, like some triumphant Caesar, leaving a trail of glory and a legend behind him. Men like Jawaharlal, with all their great capacity for great and good work, are unsafe in a democracy. He calls himself a Democrat and a socialist, and no doubt he does so in all earnestness. But a little twist, and he might turn into a dictator. Jawaharlal cannot become a fascist. He is too much of an aristocrat for the crudity and vulgarity of fascism. His very face and voice tells us that. And yet he has all the makings of a dictator in him. Vast popularity, a strong will, energy, pride. And with all his love for the crowd, an intolerance of others, and a certain contempt for the weak and inefficient. His flashes of temper are well known. His overwhelming desire is to get things done, to sweep away what he dislikes and build anew, will hardly brook for long the slow processes of democracy. His conceit is already formidable. It must be checked. We want no Caesars. Well, if you ever really wanted to run for office, I'm sure that you wouldn't want to oppose yourself.
What I wrote then was, it was really a humorous piece that I wrote. Hardly serious.
Oh, but such biting satire.
But at the same time, with, how shall I put it, not what I conceived myself to be wholly, but still what might be aspects of my nature, part of that is, of course, a person who can write that about himself, well, he can hardly be what he says I might become.
What he suggests he might become. Well, this is why I say I think you're gifted with the greatest amount of objectivity.
Yeah.
You must, in order to set up that image of yourself, didn't you find some aspect of yourself irritated by what you had said about these tendencies? Even satirically written?
Naturally. Otherwise, I sent this to a friend with no idea. Handwritten, I didn't even get it typed or anything. And it's that friend who, without really asking me, and anonymously, she also sent it to the Modern Review. And it was very amusing. When it came out in the Modern Review, I watched the effect of it on others. They were not particularly pay much attention to all that I said about myself. they came to the conclusion that this had been written naturally by some opponent of mine. And with a view to lessen my chances for re-election to the Congress presidency. It was highly amusing. In fact, I remember the matter being mentioned to Mr. Gandhi, who was in Calcutta then. I remained mum. I didn't let it out.
You didn't tell him that you had written?
No, not then. Months afterwards, I told him. 3 or 4 months afterwards. Yeah.
But was he amused when you told him?
Yes, of course he was amused. But oddly enough, one of the very, very few persons who guessed it was my daughter. She didn't know, I didn't tell her till later. She guessed it, she knows me well enough, I suppose.
Your writing style?
Not only style, but that mood, that approach.
Well, as I say, to me it shows the ultimate in objectivity. On the subject of politics and your being Prime Minister, you've also made this statement, that I've learned that a Prime Minister cannot afford to be sensitive.
Well, yes. And, no person really can be afford to be sensitive who lives with social groups and political groups and others. And a Prime Minister or even any kind of political leader has to be tough in that sense, or not too sensitive.
Yes. Your sister says that at one moment she feels she's talking to her brother and the next moment to the Prime Minister.
And the third moment probably to some stranger who was dropped in.
Are you conscious of shifting into all these changes?
I'm conscious of one thing. My mind, I'm talking to a person, unless I'm really interested in that talk, he suddenly finds that other person that I've gone away. My mind has gone away somewhere else. If he's watchful.
Yes.
I'm thinking of something else, really. I may be half following what he says, but I'm really somewhere else.
Yes. And you make reference to the fact that whenever you were bored, you resorted to your favorite remedy for boredom, standing on your head.
It's a good thing. Standing on the head.
What does it do? I've never done it.
I don't know what it does, but it certainly tones up the body, I think. Nerves, especially.
Mm-hmm.
Not for long standing. I mean, it's just, I do it for about 2 or 3 minutes at the most.
Well, does it give the impression of the upside-down world being righted when you stand on your head?
Well, not quite, but it does tone up the body, I think. One has to be careful about it, not overdoing it.
Yes. As I'm sure you know, the letter that you had circulated to a great many of your friends here in India, explaining your position about the problems that you felt faced not only India but the world, produced a great deal of interest in my country. You said at one point in the letter that in ancient days life was much simpler and closer to nature. And today in this complex world we don't have time for reflection nor questioning. And I'm hoping that at least during the time that we spend together we can do both. But you mentioned about the mental conflicts that are the accompaniment of great ages of transition. What is the specific quality of this age of transition to you?
Well, I should say the specific quality is what I've said in that letter, that man's material advance, his conquest over the powers of nature, has far outrun his conquest over himself.
Yes.
And therefore there is this hiatus, a lack of equilibrium. And problems arise unless that is bridged. Of course, perfect equilibrium doesn't exist anywhere, and I don't suppose it existed at any time. But the gap today is very big, and becomes bigger because of the pace of technological advance. More and more power comes, and the wisdom to use that power aright may not follow, and does not follow, as a matter of fact.
Well, then we need schools of introspection as well as schools of science. Is that your point?
We call it schools of introspection, or whatever the method may be, but we certainly need a great deal of quiet thinking. Even the fact of drawing yourself away for a little while from ceaseless external activity, give your mind a little rest to think. Even that is helpful.
Well, now, classically, hasn't that been reserved by men of religion?
Religion, yes. But then religion also has diverted the mind into rigid channels. Rather opposed to that spirit of free inquiry which science is supposed to encourage.
Yes.
I'm saying, the right thing, of course, is for an individual to seek the truth, try to find it, regardless of consequences. It may hurt the truth, but it does. But the truth doesn't cease to be a truth because you shut your eyes to it, because you turn away from it.
No, not
it comes with a bang later.
Well, of course, I've been very much interested in the points that you make about the conflict in your mind between the term religion and the term spirituality, which in the minds of most churchmen are one, but you do make the distinction, and that interests me a great deal.
Yes, religion should include, of course, spirituality. But religion also becomes institutionalized, with rigid forms, rigid dogmas. I don't consider them spiritual at all.
Yes.
They may be good or bad, that's a different matter. But they are restrictive and they give a certain rigidity to a person's mind. Now, mind you, religion may help a person. I mean, rigid forms of belief may help a person in the sense that they give a little comfort. They suppress doubts. You can't, responsibility you put on somebody else. Therefore, it's helpful. But any rigidity prevents growth, mental growth, spiritual growth, and all that. So, insofar as religion becomes too much attached to institutions and rigid dogmas, there is danger of the element of spirituality becoming less.
And then you also go on to say that you feel that religion, Orthodox religion that is, has a tendency to make a person more interested in his own salvation rather than in the good of society.
Yes, that is so everywhere, I suppose, but more so, I think, in India than elsewhere.
Why is that?
The whole basis of Indian thought has been rather individualistic. The individual seeking salvation by doing good works, certainly,
Yes.
by engaging in good works in society, but seeking salvation for himself.
Yes.
That has been the basis, of course. If you read the story of Buddha at the last moment refuses salvation.
Personal salvation.
Personally, he says, no. I'd rather remain and serve people or the world than merge myself by salvation into something else.
But must the two be mutually exclusive?
No, they are not exclusive. And I don't know, I'm not competent to talk about this, but the whole idea of salvation in India is based on the thought of, shall I say, on the divine element being present everywhere. That is, everything in a measure, not only a human being, but an animal or a stone or a tree, has something of the divine in it.
I realize that the pursuit of this reasoning, even in your letter, caused you to ask, rhetorically, of course, but caused you to ask the question, what is the meaning of life?
Well, listen, every sensitive person, in considering a problem, is ultimately driven to that.
Yes.
What is the meaning of my life, any life? What is the purpose of it? Well, an answer to it is frightfully difficult. But to this extent, that unless a person has some sense of mission is a big word,
Yes.
but something, some function, let us say, life becomes just a round of trivialities.
Of course.
Some function not in the sense that a person can be a dentist or a doctor or a surgeon, that's all right. It's a very good thing. I don't consider, of course, a function of merely, let us say, making money is not a function. It may be a way to an end, or just it's an exciting race, if you like.
Or a preoccupation.
Or preoccupation. So in that sense, to get the most out of life, I suppose one has to have a certain sense of mission. I don't mean that you should become a missionary in a big sense in life, and a certain coordination in one's thinking and action, which is very difficult. Because you can't always do it. I would say, even if you want to, you can't do it.
Yes, yes.
I would say, speaking about myself, that in my association for the struggle for India's freedom now provided a certain element of mission in my life, the independence of India. My acceptance intellectually and emotionally of what our leader, Mahatma Gandhi, laid down the ways, satisfied me, as I said, emotionally and intellectually, if not 100%, 90%. And my being able to act on that, not all the time, nobody can act all the time there, but whenever one could, produced a sense of fulfillment, action according to thought.
Yes.
It's not a thing which you can learn, or anybody can learn by reading a book or by listening to a speech. It's a thing you have to grow into it.
And put into practice, into action.
Yes.
Your early preoccupation with the idea of communism, which was able to give a certain kind, according to your own words, a certain kind of faith and a certain kind of discipline to the action of individuals in a society. Don't you think that in a sense...
Communism came into the picture as rather, when I say communism, please remember it has nothing to do with the Communist Party.
It had nothing to do with the Soviet Union as such.
It is only an attempt at a scientific understanding of social forces. So I was attracted to this theory, originally Marxian theory, broadly because it seemed to make me understand the processes of history more. I didn't accept everything that he said. He was no dogma for me.
No, well, you don't accept dogma in anything.
No, anything. It was nothing. And some things seemed to me out of date, what he had said, even then, and more so now. But there was that approach and some kind of an explanation of this dynamic of history. That was what interested.
Yes. You went on further to suggest in this article, Mr. Nehru, that democracy and socialism are means to an end, that they're not the end itself.
Well, yes, the end is the development of the individual and the group. Of the individual, I would say, principally, in a group. You can't I don't think you can develop a group unless the individual, ultimately, unless the individual also develops.
Well, then don't we live with the means constantly and perhaps never achieve the end?
Yes, but we go towards an end. In fact, the end always recedes.
From us?
Yes, well, because there's no end, final end. If you reach one stage of a journey, immediately there's the next stage.
Well, and actually, this is the problem with the current brand of what we understand to be communism, isn't it? As it's been politically implemented.
Yes, yes, yes. That is, there is too much suppression of the individual, alliance, if you like, with violent methods. Of course, there are violent methods quite outside communism, quite a lot of them too. There's no doubt about it.
Of course.
But there is that. And ultimately, I think they have bad results. There's one thing which I think I've said in that note, talking about the Soviet Union, that by the mere processes of working as they have done, they have to have large-scale education, and very good education. That is a liberating factor again. It won't uproot the Soviet state. It will change their thinking, and as to some extent it has changed, and make them think less on those rigid lines as they used to. Because ultimately, education on right lines is the biggest liberating factor of a man.
Of course. Well, then isn't this part of the answer to the thing that you posed about we talk of the good of society and the necessity for uplifting the individual, whereas in this particular day and age, the individual seems to be lost in the mass. We speak in terms of mass figures. People in the West refer to India and China as having teeming millions. I've never heard the expression teeming millions of Americans, and yet we do teem with millions of Americans.
And certainly in the big cities.
And most particularly, and I know because I live in New York.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that this emphasis on the mass takes away from the value of the individual. We see a mass of 2.5 billion people. Don't you think what we have to do, if we have the mental elasticity, is to see instead 2.5 billion individual worlds?
Well, yes, although it's frightfully difficult. But I've often said, when asked, well, how many problems have you got in India? My answer has been 370 million problems, which is more or less what you have said.
Exactly, individual problems.
Yes, yes.
You go on to make the point, and I think a very good point, that in India today, as for the most part of the world, there seems to be an absence of the old spirit of buoyancy, and instead you have an atmosphere of depression. And that one of your colleagues, or close colleagues, suggested that this probably was due to the fact that there seems to be an absence of a philosophy about life.
Yes.
Well, do you find that stronger in India today than 10 years ago?
Well, 10 or 11 years ago, soon after independence, there was naturally a tremendous feeling of buoyancy as a result of having achieved something for which we had struggled for generations. The immediate result was great buoyancy, of course. Although even then we had a lot of trouble, as you know, the partition of India and all that was horrible. But when people do not achieve something rapidly again, then there's no frustration. You see, basically, in Europe, Western Europe, in America, the economic revolution preceded the political one.
Yes.
And thereby, resources were created to satisfy political demands.
But you've got the opposite here.
It is opposite here.
Yes.
We get the political one without the economic resources.
Which is doing it the harder way.
Yes.
Much.
Yes. Well, there's no choice about it, I'm saying.
No, of course not. You have to work with what you have at hand.
So I firmly believe in a thing which, well, I can't prove, but it seems to me almost a scientific law, one of physics or chemistry, that what you give, you will receive. If you give hatred, you'll get hatred in return. If you give affection, you'll get affection. And so on. And say, you can never, you have to pay for things you get. Pay, not in terms of cash, of course, I mean to say.
No, but in terms of balance.
In terms of balances. And you can't say, it's a two-way traffic.
Well, Mr. Nehru, does this represent your concept of what we call foreign policy?
I should like it to represent it, but so many things, national interests, what are supposed to be national interests, pressures, and especially in a democratic state, you can't do things which you cannot explain and make and get the people to accept. There are limitations.
Of course.
But basically, that is the concept of having goodwill and good relations. Mind you, people seem to imagine that if you differ from a person, you must dislike him.
Yes. If you differ from a person.
If you differ, yes. And you must indeed try to push him out or knock him out. Now, that is a basic error. And what Gandhi succeeded in doing was in holding to something he considered a principle with amazing strength, not losing, it doesn't matter what happened. And yet being friendly to the man who was opposing him.
Difficult thing to do in this society of ours.
No, it's very difficult to do it perfectly. But imperfectly, if you like, or partly, the attempt to be made, that even that does some good. After all, in normal working of democracy, there are various groups opposing each other.
Yes.
You don't go about hitting each other politically.
Hardly.
You deliver a speech against each other. and whatever the majority decision is, well, people accept it till it is changed. Well, why not extend that principle to all the other relations?
Including foreign policy.
Including foreign policy, international affairs, and all that. That is to say, if you hold to a certain policy or truth, hold to it. Nobody asks you to give it up. But do not approach the other country, which may be different, with hostility and ferocity. Because the only result is that the other country approaches you in the same way.
That was all right when we carried nightsticks and blunderbusses, but it's hardly suitable to a nuclear society, is it?
No, I should say it is more necessary.
Yes, it's the
more. I'm not saying for the moment that, let us take disarmament. I realize that no country, as I know them, can afford, because of love of humanity, to disarm by itself, trusting to others. I appreciate that. Politically, a politician cannot put that forward. A saint might. A politician can't. Although, at the back of my mind, I have an idea that if a country was strong enough and brave enough to do that, it would revolutionize international policies of other countries.
But who to take the first step?
Yes, it's difficult. Anyhow, no politician can do it. But I don't see why you shouldn't approach the other country in a friendly way. I mean, say, you are not disarming, let us say, for the present. But why threaten the other country? Why frighten the other country? Try to disarm, talk about it, and succeed. Create an atmosphere of friendliness, or at any rate of lack of hostility.
You likened it to the animal. If you approach an animal full of fear, he will sense that fear and then attack you in self-defense.
Absolutely. And you are completely right. The thing that is the worst thing in the world today is this sense of fear. From fear, nothing good comes. I once said, fear is not a good companion. Now, I give you a personal experience. I have traveled a fair amount, all kinds of countries. And it has been my good fortune to be welcomed wherever I have gone. Whether it is Western Europe or America or Russia or China or Japan or Africa. And welcome not officially, that of course, but by the people.
Yes.
Now, inevitably, I have felt warmed up by that welcome. And I've reacted in a friendly way to those people, regardless of policies. When the question of policy came, well, I told them that in this we differ. But still, there's very much in common. I laid more stress on the common features than the differences. They were different. I didn't give up my difference, it was too big for me. But I laid stress on common features. There are always common features.
Yes.
One doesn't differ in everything.
Hardly.
And so I created an atmosphere of general friendliness, in spite of the difference of opinion. And in which one could function easily, and one could perhaps take step by step, one could go in a particular direction of even solving those problems.
I would like very much to discuss with you some of your reflections which you wrote while you were in prison, which was published in the form of your autobiography. I realize that a great deal of time has passed between what you had written during that period and today. But it would be most fascinating and interesting to discuss with you what your reflexes and attitudes might be now in the light of the experiences that you've had since becoming Prime Minister.
As I wrote this book a quarter of a century ago now, it seems very familiar and yet distant.
Yes. Well, I think that conflict runs through even your appraisal of yourself.
Yes.
You said I became a queer mixture of the East and the West, out of place everywhere, at home nowhere. That's a very poignant statement for a man to write about himself. I have a feeling of spiritual loneliness, not only in public activities, but in life itself. Now, obviously, that was true then. That was the way you felt then. Does
Yes.
that have any relation to the way you feel today?
Well, yes, to some extent. Not in one's work so much, because one is absorbed in one's work. But outside that work, that feeling creeps upon one.
Spiritual loneliness.
Yes, I suppose that is the nearest way of describing it.
Is it difficult, do you find that it's difficult to establish, shall we say, spiritual rapport with other people, with your associates, with your friends?
There is rapport in a particular phase of activity or department of life, there may be complete rapport in that, in which I'm working with them.
Yes.
And there may not be in another aspect of oneself. This kind of 100% rapport is very difficult to find anywhere, I suppose, between individuals.
Yes, of course.
It's a percentage.
Well, and you still do feel a sense of spiritual loneliness.
Yes, certainly, I feel it. I don't mean to say that I'm always feeling it or feeling frustrated. Not that. I'm not a person who's, I'm not a frustrated person at all.
You don't give that impression.
I have a feeling of, if I may say so, of a certain satisfaction with the opportunities I've had in life. And so I have no sense of frustration, but undoubtedly there's a feeling of loneliness which creeps upon one. I'd always thought that that would be rather normal, almost, that feeling, for many people who are sensitive. And it's a curious thing, how in the middle of a crowd, I am one of the crowd and yet apart from it.
Yes. Well, that's another part of this conflict that you've developed down through the years. But getting back to the queer mixture, as you refer to yourself as being the queer mixture of the East and West, out of place everywhere, at home nowhere. Do you feel that today?
Well, it's difficult to say. One has that feeling sometimes. On the other hand, there's a counterpart of that, of being at home everywhere to some extent.
But you do have, Mr. Nehru, the day that you became Prime Minister. I wonder what your feeling was. I wonder if you can recapture it. The feeling that you had finally succeeded, not in becoming Prime Minister, but in getting independence for India. And that you had many years ahead of you to see the fruits of all those years of labor.
Have you seen the little speech I delivered on that occasion?
I don't recall it.
Well, I'll show it to you afterwards.
Good, I'd love to see it.
It's just a small one. When we decided, you see, changeover came at midnight. Naturally, from one day to the other, we decided to observe it at midnight. And we met, our assembly met at midnight. And just before midnight, all the members took their oath of allegiance to the new India. And then I said a few words, 5 or 7 minutes I spoke, only rather good, if I may say so, suited to the occasion. And then, well, of course there's a feeling of elation, I suppose, and a feeling of achievement, but it was tempered.
By the partition?
By the partition and all that. Although we didn't know all the horrors of partition then, they came a little later.
Yes.
Still, there was a fear that all was not well there. This is the speech I made at that midnight hour in our assembly.
Oh, please, please, won't you read it to me? I'd love to hear it.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny. And now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. A moment comes, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new, when an age ends, and when the soul of elation, long suppressed, finds utterance. At the dawn of history, India started on her unending quest, and trackless centuries are filled with her striving and the grandeur of her success and her failures. Through good and ill fortune alike, she has never lost sight of that quest or forgotten the ideals which gave her strength. We end today a period of ill fortune, and India discovers herself again. Before the birth of freedom, we have endured all the pains of labor, and our hearts are heavy with the memory of this sorrow. Some of these pains continue even now. Nevertheless, the past is over, and it is the future that beckons to us now. That future is not one of ease or resting, but of incessant striving, so that we may fulfill the pledges we have so often taken and the one we shall take today. The service of India means the service of the millions who suffer. It means the ending of poverty and ignorance and disease and inequality of opportunity. The ambition of the greatest man of our generation has been to wipe every tear from every eye. That may be beyond us, but as long as there are tears and suffering, so long our work will not be over. And so we have to labor and to work hard to give reality to our dreams. Those dreams are for India, but they are also for the world, for all the nations and peoples are too closely knit together today for any one of them to imagine that it can live apart. Peace has been said to be indivisible, so is freedom, so is prosperity now, and so is disaster in this one world that can no longer be split into isolated fragments. To the people of India, whose representatives we are, we make an appeal to join us with faith and confidence in this great adventure. This is no time for petty and destructive criticism, no time for ill will or blaming others. We have to build the noble mansion of free India, where all her children may dwell.